Well, Admiral Jim Stockdale was the highest-ranking U.S. military officer who was at the Hanoi Hilton. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's the famous or infamous prisoner of war camp that was there at the height of the Vietnam War. And he was in that camp for 8 years, tortured over 20 times, and yet he made it out. He and many of the men made it out. They were tortured, they were beaten, they had no release date, they weren't given the rights of prisoners, and they had no certainty that they would see their families. And yet they persevered. The question is how? Well, he knew that it was going to be a while if they were going to get out at all. And so what he did is that he started to develop different ways of survival in the camp. There were things like tap codes to communicate between prisoners and to disrupt the intelligence there. There was rules to help people with torture because he realized that no one can withstand torture forever. And so he gave rules as far as if you've been tortured for this long, you can give this amount of information, this long, this amount, to help people hold out, to give them stepping stones. There were various ways in which they were dealing with the crisis that they faced, this situation. And when asked once, what was the difference between the people who made it through and the people who didn't? Who were the folks who didn't make it through? He said, oh, that's an easy question. It was the optimist. They said, we'll be out by Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving came around and they weren't out. Oh, we'll be out by Christmas. Christmas came around and they weren't out. We'll be out by Easter. Easter came around and they weren't out. They'll be out by the next Thanksgiving. The next Thanksgiving came around and they weren't out, and they died, he said, of disillusion and brokenheartedness. But those who actually faced the situation, the real brutal facts of the situation, and lived in light of those, they made it through. It's a lesson about expectations and what expectations we can have. And this morning we have a text that I think gives us the proper expectations we can have. Because we have looked at Genesis 1 and 2, and we have seen this beautiful and grand design that God had in the beginning for work. How he intended work, how he gave dignity to work, the purposes of work in the world. But we don't live in the world of Genesis 1 and 2. We live in the world of Genesis 3 following. And that world is quite different. And in that world, we have to have different expectations about what we are going to face at work. And so on my count, this text gives us 7 expectations, 7 things that we can expect to experience in work. And if I move quickly, we may get to all of them. We'll see. The first thing is that we can expect to experience temptation at work. The story opens in verse 1 with the serpent coming and tempting the woman. We see this, what they were tempted with in verse 4. Look, the serpent says, "You will surely not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, that is the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Now notice what she was tempted with. It says that the fruit of the tree, she saw that it was good for food. Provision. She was tempted to take this tree as provision. Look also that it says that she saw that it was a delight to the eyes. That is, that she saw it as something that was satisfying, pleasurable. And also note that it says that it was desired to make one wise. Knowledge, power. In fact, the serpent says, you will be like God. And that's what the temptation was, to have provision and pleasure and power, but to have them without God. And it was at that place, that workspace, where she was tempted to do this. Out in the garden. Maybe, who knows, pruning the trees. Well, how did this temptation work? How did Satan get her to take the fruit? This dark, evil force behind the serpent's actions. Well, notice what he says. In verse 1, it says, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Of course, that's not what God said. God said about the opposite in Genesis 2:16. You may surely eat of every tree in the garden. You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, every tree. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. God said, you can have any tree you want except this one tree. And Satan says, didn't he say you can't have any? Well, notice how Eve responds. Rightly, she corrects him. We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. That's correct. But God said, now what did Eve remember God saying? But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of any tree that is in the midst of you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die. But God never said that. God never said that you couldn't touch it. But you see, what has happened is that Satan has warped her thinking into thinking that what God is doing is he is not generous, he is strict. He is not kind and gracious, he is stingy. And as soon as that mental change happens, basically what happens is she thinks, God is holding out on me. And once she thinks God is holding out on me, she reaches for the fruit. And we're tempted with the same. That's how it works for us as well. We start to think that God is holding out on us, and if I am going to have provision, if I'm going to have pleasure, if I'm going to get any sort of power, satisfaction, fulfillment in life, then I have to do it without him. I have to go it alone. And that's exactly what we're tempted to do. To think that we are the masters of our destiny, and we use work as a way of trying to achieve that, of taking control of our lives. It's a temptation that we're all faced with. That somehow we can find a sense of identity. That's why we go to work, to build a name for ourselves, to have other people notice us or recognize us. We go to work to think that, well, if I can just provide for my family, not realizing that at the end of the day, all of it comes from God. He provides daily bread. We think that if we have job security, we have security. But I'm sure that Steve Jobs had the highest job security of anyone in the world at the end there. But he was not secure. See, we believe the lie. We believe the lie. And as Christians, we will experience this temptation at work, and we can expect to experience this temptation at work. And so we need to be asking the question, what am I looking to get out of my work that only God can give me? What things am I looking to from my work? Am I looking for my work to give me, to provide for me, that only God can give me? Is it a sense of security? Is it a sense of value, identity? What is it? So the first thing we can expect to face is temptation. But the second thing that I think that we can expect to face is we need to expect to experience shame at work. Shame is the sense of being uneasy with yourself at the very core of who you are. Guilt says, I did wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. And the problem is with this uneasiness is that we often can't locate it. We just feel wrong. And because of that, it's easier to locate the symptoms than it is the causes. And we see the symptom right here. Look, Adam and Eve, they knew that there was something wrong with them. Verse 7. And the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves a loincloth. See, notice what they do because of their shame. They hide. They're hiding from one another. They're trying to protect what the other person knows about them. And we operate out of shame all the time through our work. We hide through performance. We say, if we work so hard to say, if you just look at me, look at my work, don't look at me. Look at the things that I'm accomplishing, but don't look at my soul. And this is what makes us restless, and we are restless in our jobs and continuing to work and work and work and work so that no one will see us. It's a deflection mechanism. It's a way of hiding. And because of this, there's this deep anxiety that exists between many of us, and many of us, that at some point people are going to find us out, and so we're worried. That worry that people are going to find you out. Some of you maybe have read or read The Onion. It's a satirical newspaper. And there was an article out at the beginning of the year in The Onion called, "Today, the day they find out you're a fraud." Listen to what it says. While experts agree you've been remarkably successful so far at keeping up the ruse that you're a capable, worthwhile individual, a report out this week indicates that today is the day they finally figure out you're a complete and utter fraud. The report, compiled by the Pew Research Center, states that sometime within the next 24 hours, people will find out that you have no idea what you're doing, that you've been faking it for years, and that through continuous lying and shameless posturing, you actually managed to dupe virtually everyone around you into thinking that you're something other than a weak and ineffectual person. They've had their suspicions all along, sources said, but today their suspicions will be confirmed. Now, I must admit, it's funny, it's extreme, but does anyone relate? Because I do. Not every day, not every moment, but I certainly feel like that. When are they going to figure out that I have no idea what I'm doing, that I shouldn't be in this role, that I'm not competent here? You experience it in when you perhaps maybe at some point you got into a class and you were like, I really shouldn't be in this class. You got into a school, I really shouldn't be in this school. You got a job and you're like, oh no. And the whole time you feel like you're faking it. And there's this kind of anxiety that people are going to find out. And so then because of that, we are defensive when people talk about our work because we're worried that they might see. We might be found out. We're self-protective. We evade the truth. We're dishonest. But why is it that we hide? Why is it that we hide in a state of shame? Well, there are lots of answers out there in the culture. Some will say we hide because of a bad upbringing. We hide because of these false conceptions of social pressures. That's the reason we hide. But actually, the Christianity has a deeper answer, a more substantial answer, and it's right there in verse 8. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. Why do we hide? Who are we ultimately hiding from? God. You see, the sense that I am wrong and that my relationship with God is actually off means that I have to try to deny that, and I know that there's something wrong with me, but I can't face that, and so we gesture and posture and hide. See, have you ever asked, why the long hours? Why the attempt to get noticed? Why the Google searches? Why? Could it be that we are acting out of a sense of shame? And if you're a Christian, then you realize that this is something that we're going to face at work, and the only solution, we have the solution, the only solution is to realize this, that He knows everything about me. And He loves me anyway because of Jesus. that the cross covers your shame. And because of that, you don't have to fear being found out, and therefore you don't have to evade the truth. You don't have to gesture and posture. You don't have to work restlessly, but you can rest in him. Because he knows everything about you, and he loves you anyway. We can expect to experience shame, though. Third, we can expect to experience pain at work. We saw in Genesis 1, 26 through 28, that God gave humanity two fundamental tasks. And those two fundamental tasks was community making, be fruitful and multiply, and world building, fill the earth and subdue it. But we see that those things are deeply affected here. In verses 15 through 19, the garden turns into a courtroom. And God becomes a judge. And he declares a sentence on humanity. And he gives a punishment. And he puts the world under a curse. And you need to realize that while work is not itself a curse, it's an important statement. Work is not itself a curse. Work, like every other human activity and endeavor, lies under the curse of sin. And so that curse, it brings pain into these two primary tasks of community making and world building. The curse brings pain to childbearing. Look, verse 16. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Now, they were called to be fruitful and multiply, but the multiplication of children is going to come along with a multiplication of pain. The word play is intentional. And this pain, it's not hard. It's hard to think about what childbearing and child rearing would have been like before Genesis 3, but it's not hard to see the pain afterwards. And a lot of it's silent pain. The pain of infertility that no one talks about. The pain of pregnancy that ended early. And you think, what's wrong with me? Well, it's not so much that something is wrong with you particularly. It's that something is wrong with the world. It's under the curse. And so there's pain. And then there's the not-so-silent pain. There's the pain of labor itself, which I have not even experienced firsthand, but I still passed out. Like the doctors and nurses literally sent me out of the room. And if you need confirmation on that, you can ask Pam, right? And I am such a wimp, right? But this is me. Like, this is my experience. Whew. The Lord knew what he was doing. And, well, never mind. But there's that pain. But the pain doesn't end there, does it? I mean, the pain continues throughout raising a child. With the colicky nights and the screaming and the fighting. And every time you try to help them, they resist you. We've been experiencing this lately. Neve has been taking 2 hours lately to go to sleep. 2 hours in and out. And she just throws these huge fits, and we feel out of our depth. And then she comes in the middle of the night, and she used to sleep so good. It's hard. It's difficult. And I haven't even, I'm thinking, then I hear the people talking about middle schoolers. Then I think about me as a middle schooler. And then I think, oh, no. And I can't tell you, it doesn't end, does it? Because I can't tell you how many parents I have sat down with as a pastor. And this has been one of the most eye-opening experiences for me, is to sit down with parents of adult children and to see the pain that they experience because of the decisions that their adult children are making. Raising children is painful. Bringing children into the world is painful. The curse makes childbearing and rearing painful. And the curse also brings pain to world making. Look in verse 17. And to Adam he said, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all your days. I was speaking to someone recently who moved to Santa Barbara, got a great job, but this job requires them to lift a lot, and because of that, they have been in a severe amount of back pain sometimes unable to get out of bed in the morning. And it's not just manual labor jobs where we find that we have pain. I mean, think of all the carpal tunnel syndrome and vision problems and other things, headaches. The work is filled with pain. And the pain is not simply physical. I mean, this word pain here is broader than that. It means difficulty and hardships. And work is difficult. It is difficult to accomplish things in the world. No matter what sphere you're in, no matter what vocation you are called to, it's not easy. Do you find that the two great tasks in life of love and work, of relationships and work, of bearing children and raising children and of working, do you find that those are excruciatingly hard? Well, this is why. And so as Christians, we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised, and we should neither be Pollyanna about work and the task that God's called us to, but nor should we get disillusioned when it doesn't work out smoothly. We should expect the hard realities. That just because it hurts doesn't mean that it's bad or wrong. Doesn't mean that we should give up or not do it. That we should expect difficulty in whatever task we pursue. And that in order to accomplish things in the world, it takes some serious resolve. And there's going to be some blood, sweat, and tears. That's life under the curse. Booker T. Washington once said that nothing ever comes to one that is worth having except as the result of hard work. And in most cases, that feels true. Which brings us to the fourth thing I think that we can expect, and we should expect at work, and that's this. We should expect to experience frustration. Verse 18 talks about thorns and thistles. It says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the fields." Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that thorns and thistles didn't exist before the fall. I don't think that you don't have to read the text that way, and I wouldn't read it that way. Actually, what I think that this is saying is that clearly the context is talking about Adam and Eve trying to cultivate the ground to bring forth fruit and plant life that they can eat, that you shall eat of it, plants that you shall eat of the field. But the problem is that instead of plants, they're getting thorns and thistles. And the problem with thorns and thistles is humans can't eat them, right? Our work is fruitless. We try to produce one thing and it doesn't come about. And it feels vain. And so that causes frustration. We can be frustrated by our own lack of ability. And the play turned movie Amadeus is about a composer named Salieri. And Salieri, his great goal in life and the thing that he wants most is to create beautiful music. And he has sought God to give him the gifts and the talents to make beautiful music. But he knows that he can make okay music. It's beautiful, it's good, but it's not great. And this is rubbed in his face when he meets Mozart. And he hears Mozart play. And then it gets even, this frustration becomes even more compounded because he has spent all his days, all his life trying to serve God with music, and yet he still can't make as good of music or anywhere near as good as Mozart. And yet Mozart, we find, is not trying to follow God, not a Christian. And so he becomes disillusioned and upset and frustrated. And there's this one scene where he's talking to a priest, and he looks up at the cross on a wall, and the fire's lit, and he's in the room, and he basically said, I want some sign that you love me or of your grace. And he goes on, "From now on, we are enemies, you and I, because you will not enter me with all my need for you, because you scorn my attempts at virtue, because you choose for your instrument a boastful, lustful, smutty, infantile boy, and give me for reward only the ability to recognize his ability." Salieri, he's frustrated by the fact that He can recognize Mozart's ability, this ability that he wants, but he doesn't have the ability to produce what Mozart can produce. And I'm sure you've probably experienced it as well. That person who just, that they spend half as much FaceTime with people, and yet they sell 3 times as much as you. And you're like, how do they do that? They spend way less time actually working on, algebra, and yet it just comes naturally to them. I had a friend I grew up with in high school, and all his life he wanted to be a Navy SEAL. He wanted to be a Navy SEAL so bad that after football practice, he would go run extra miles. There was a big river by Memphis. You might have heard of it. It's called the Mississippi. And he lived right by it. And when it would rain and flood, he would go run up and down the banks of the river and do army crawls in high school, right? His whole life, he just wanted to be a Navy SEAL. And then he goes, and there were a couple problems. His eyes weren't perfect. And his feet were flat. And he went through a long process, but finally, health-wise, he just didn't have the ability to make it through. As hard as he worked, as much as he wanted to do it, he lacked the ability. And it's frustrating. We can be frustrated by our lack of ability. We can be frustrated by our lack of opportunity. Unfortunately, we're not always able to do what we most want to do or are most gifted at, what we most enjoy in life. Maybe it's that the job came up, but it's the wrong place and it's the wrong time and you can't move. Maybe it's that you have this thing that you love and that you do and that you're good at, but you can't find a way to support your family doing that. The opportunities maybe aren't there. And we can be frustrated by this. And because of that, as Christians, we have to find alternative ways. We have to recognize this and find alternative ways to use our gifts and skills and enjoyment, and recognize that in this fallen world, we're not always going to be in our sweet spot. It's probably not going to happen. And so we're okay with approximate, and we're okay with having some overlap. We can be frustrated by our ability, by our opportunity, also by the environment itself. I mean, all of us can envision far more than we actually accomplish in any kind of day. I was talking to someone the other day, and they said that they looked around their office, and they looked at their calendar, and they saw that the work was pretty much done for the day. So they left early and took a bike ride. That is an exceptional day. That's an exceptional day because most of us don't have those days most of the time. Most of the days we look at our checklist and we're like, I only got through half of this stuff into the time. And maybe it's not that we're not working, it's just that the system is working against us. Ecclesiastes, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, Then I considered all the work of my hands and the toil that I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Maybe it's that you made an incredible product, but because of copyright issues, it never went forward. Maybe it's that you are a small business owner and you have created a business that's doing well and thriving, but then all your suppliers are taken out by a tornado. And it wasn't up to you, but it's just frustrating. And it doesn't go forward. Maybe you're like me and you've found a job that you love so much of, and that you love to be able to preach and to be able to teach and to be involved in the life of the church. But at the end of the day, there's just not a lot of time for research and writing these other things that you love. That's life in a fallen world. Tim Keller said this, just because you can't realize your highest aspiration in work does not mean that you have chosen wrongly or are not called to your profession, or that you should spend your life looking for the perfect career that is devoid of frustration. That would be a fruitless search for anyone. You should expect to be regularly frustrated in your work, even though you may be in exactly the right vocation. Now, the key here is to stay between the two extremes. On the one extremes are the kind of younger generation who think, I should be as most satisfied as I can be all the time at work. And so we look for that perfect job and we can't find it. And so we just stay out of work. Right? Or we go bouncing from one job to the next. That's one side. The other side is kind of if you look at my grandfather's generation, post-World War II, they were happy. They didn't have any choices. They were happy just to have a job. And so they had a job, but they never tried to look for something that actually fit them at all. And I say that we need to actually see that we can look somewhere in between. That on the one hand, it's okay to try to find something that is more fulfilling and that it fits you. But it's also, we need to realize that as Christians that we are going to be frustrated in whatever job we are in. Life in a fallen world. So how do we deal with this frustration? Well, we deal with it by remembering the promise. In Joel chapter 2, verse 25, the people of Israel have been cursed. Their crops have been eaten by locusts. It's a curse that came from God because of their sin. And God says in Joel 2:25 that He will and can restore the years that the locusts have eaten. And I believe that this curse, which is because of our sin, that has devastated our crop and our work, that God can even restore those years. The years that the curse has eaten and stolen and all the frustration. And we look forward to that, and we look forward to an eternity of working with the curse removed and lifted. 5, we can expect to experience stress at work. We should expect to experience stress at work. In verse 19 it says, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. And I don't think that's talking about the weather. And why are Adam and Eve sweating? I don't think that something just happened where they never sweat before. I don't think that it's that it never rose, it got above 70 degrees. Now, the sweat here is actually a physical reaction to anxiety. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. That is, you shall get food, you shall feed yourself. There will be stress involved, and it starts so early. I was just talking to someone this week who was in middle school, and this person said, I said, what are you doing outside of school? And this person said to me, nothing. School is just so stressful this year. And you usually expect it to be stressful at the beginning of the year, but it's not going to let up this year. And I thought to myself, do I remember having stress as a middle schooler? I guess I did. I don't remember it. But it starts so early, and it continues on. But will the commission pay for the child's tuition? Will I be able to put food on the table and pay my bills? Will I make the deadline? Will I make the quota? Is my job secure? But where does our stress come from? Well, just think about what all those questions assume. They assume that it's up to me, that I have to do it. And that's exactly what happens in the fall, that we think that it's all up to us, that daily bread is on us. Jesus says, do not be anxious about your life and what you will eat or what you will drink, nor your body what you will put on. But we are anxious because we don't believe. But you see, God, He will give us what we need. He will provide for us. And that's what allows us to release the stress, or the distress, and the anxiety and the worry. Because He says, look at the ravens, look at the lilies. God provides. Your heavenly Father knows what they need. He knows what you need. And He knows that what we need most is to depend on Him. And sometimes the stresses and strains that we feel, we are being given those for our good, that we might lean into Him and trust Him. We can expect to experience stress at work. 6, we can expect to experience alienation at work. In verse 16, when God is giving the curse to the woman, he says, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Now, there's been a lot of hypotheses as to what these mean. This means, and some people think that what this means is that she will have loving or sexual desire for her husband, but he will dominate, authoritarian, abusively rule over her. Now, I don't want to undermine, and I want to be very clear about this. The fall has caused devastating effects in domestic life. And that is not something to belittle, and it's certainly not something to dismiss. That has certainly happened. But that's not what this text is talking about. When it talks about desire, the lexical support for this, it just won't support the fact that it's sexual desire. And the word rule there is not used for abusive rule. It doesn't support that. In fact, if we don't want to know what this means, we can just go to the next chapter. It's pretty clear. In the next chapter, God is talking to Cain. And God says to Cain in chapter 4, verse 7, "If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you. Right? But you must rule over it." Hear the parallelism? Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Well, in this circumstance, what does it mean that its desire is for you? It means that it is trying to take Cain over. And you must rule over it is the response to that. What it's talking about then, if we take this back up into your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you, is it's talking about the competition. The competition that happens now in human relationships, in the primary relationship of marriage, but in all human relationships because of the fall. And this competition works out in our work. Ecclesiastes 4:4 says, "Then I saw all the toil and all the skill and work that came from man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity, striving after the wind." When we seek to build our own identity, when we seek to gain our own security from our work, what happens is that will always put us in competition with another. In a sinful competition. And the symptoms of it are all around us. It looks like devaluing other workers and other work. This happens with me. I'll confess my own sin to you. I roll my eyes. This is wrong. This is wrong. I roll my eyes whenever I hear of someone having a D-min, and calling themselves a doctor, because I think that's such a lower degree and whatever. And that's wrong, because what I'm not doing is recognizing the value in that degree. Now, there are reasons that Christians shouldn't have degree inflation, and that's another conversation. My MDiv should probably be called a BDiv, but that's another conversation. What I'm focusing on is the fact that I am unable to find value in that. Why? Because I have to define myself over against. And it's sin. And it's wrong. And we do it all the time. It comes from blaming. We see it in blaming. The first thing Adam does is he says, "It's the woman who you gave me so that we can be free and clear." And it's shown in our inability to celebrate the success of others. Because we're so hungry for our own, and we're worried that our glory is going to be overshadowed. And the cure for this is realizing that you have God who applauds you because of Jesus. And you don't have to gain a name for yourself. You have a name from him. His name is written on your forehead in baptism. And your name is on his hand. And therefore, you don't need to try to make a name for yourself in this competition over against others. See, the gospel, it enables us to face the alienation, to face the shame, to face the stress, to face the frustration and the pain and the temptation. It enables us to face all of it. But there's one more thing that we can expect from work in this text. I'll close with this. 7th, we can expect to experience a paradox at work. Look in verse 16. It says, "In pain you shall bring forth children." Verse 18, "Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field." Notice it doesn't say that you won't bring forth children or that you won't eat the plants of the field. You will do both of those. In other words, work is now a paradox because work is in a world sustained by God but disordered by sin. And that means what verse 16 verse 18 are saying is that work is going to be both frustrating but also fulfilling at the same time. That actually work works, it just doesn't work perfectly or well. That work still does actually, we can still use it as a means of loving our neighbor and building something of the world and doing things. And so work in a fallen world, it is this paradox. It is frustrating and seems like vanity often, and yet at the same time it is a gift of God to be used for God. And that it actually does, we believe, do something in His world, do something good. When asked basically about how despondent he must have been, Admiral Stockdale said, no, and he corrected the person interviewing. He said, "I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never lost faith, even though I looked at the hard realities. I never lost faith in the fact that we would get out." And so Jim Collins, in his book Good to Great, talks about the Stockdale paradox. That is that companies who retain faith that they will prevail in the end regardless of the difficulties, and at the same time confront the brutal facts of their current reality, those are the companies that succeed. And I think as Christians, we're called to do the same thing. We're called to actually have retained faith that that God will prevail at the end, that our work will prevail at the end. Because Romans 8:21 says that the creation will be liberated from its bondage to decay. It alludes to Genesis 3, and it says that the curse will be lifted. And yet there is the curse. And we have to confront the most brutal facts of our current reality. And when we can hold those two things together, we can walk forward. We can walk forward and work for the glory of God and the good of this world. Let me pray. Lord, we pray that you would walk with us, that you would give us a proper perspective, that you would establish the work of our hands. For Christ's sake, amen.